All right, so you guys have really sent us a hot potato this time.
Yeah.
With this set of articles, we're diving into President Trump's shakeup at the Pentagon. And let me tell you, it's pretty wild.
It's unprecedented what we're seeing here. The level of turnover in military leadership,
Yeah.
right in the middle of a presidential term, it's just not something you see very often.
No, and we're not talking about, junior officers or anything. This is
the top brass.
This is top brass.
Yeah, exactly.
It's talking General C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, out.
Gone. And he's the second black officer to ever head that position, too. So it's adding, I think,
absolutely,
another whole layer to this.
Yeah, it just adds a whole other layer of complexity here. And then on top of that, you have Admiral Lisa Franchetti, who is going to be the first woman to lead the Navy.
Historic.
First woman to lead a military service.
Gone.
Yeah.
Even the judge advocates general for the Army, Navy, Air Force.
Wow. The people responsible for military justice,
That's a big one.
they've been replaced.
Really sweeping changes.
I mean, it just makes you wonder what kind of message this sends to people currently serving in the military.
Absolutely.
If you are, a young officer and you see these high-profile figures being dismissed, I mean, especially if you are a woman or a minority, what does that say about your own future?
What does it say about your future? Exactly. What does it say about the values of the military?
Yeah.
That's what I keep coming back to is like, what does this say about
the
trajectory of the armed forces?
It seems like a pretty clear message.
It does seem like a pretty clear message. And we're seeing that reflected in the reaction, right? I mean, a lot of people are asking these questions.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual careers at this point. It's about the impact on morale, on unit cohesion, on trust and leadership.
Yeah.
These are the things that make a military function.
Yeah. I mean, these firings
Right.
have the potential to disrupt those things in a big way.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've seen some pretty strong reactions coming from Democratic lawmakers.
Oh, yeah.
Haven't we?
Oh, yeah.
Throwing around some really, really strong words like un-American and dangerous.
You don't see that very often.
Trump of politicizing the military.
Right.
Which, again,
Politicizing the military. Yeah, that's the big concern here. And I think Senator Jack Reed put it very well when he argued that, firing military leaders based on political loyalty tests instead of their actual performance erodes the trust and professionalism that the military depends on.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I keep coming back to is this is the kind of thing that it just really kind of muddies the water.
It muddies the waters.
Between civilian oversight and military independence.
Absolutely. It really does.
And I think going forward, that's one of the things that we really need to think about is what does this mean for that delicate balance of power?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's going to be a key question that we have to sort of unpack as we go deeper. But before we do that, I think it's important to understand who exactly is replacing these folks, who is coming into these positions.
Yeah.
So we know that General Brown's replacement is Lieutenant General Dan Caine, who is being pulled out of retirement for this.
Yeah, and that's, bringing someone back from retirement for a position like that.
Very unusual.
That's unusual.
Very unusual.
To say the least.
To say the least.
It suggests that they're really scrambling to find people who align with this new vision.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a safe assumption.
Yeah.
And, we should also remember that this isn't the first time we've seen this.
Right.
This isn't an isolated incident, right? This pattern of removing women, high-ranking women, from the military began on Trump's first day back in office when he dismissed Admiral Linda Fagan, the first female commandant of the Coast Guard.
And it's hard not to connect the dots here between these personnel changes and all of Trump's campaign rhetoric about, getting rid of the quote-unquote woke generals.
Right.
Especially the ones that he blames for the 2021 Afghanistan withdrawal.
Absolutely. And I think that's where we need to look at, what Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has been saying, particularly in his book, The War on Warriors, Behind the Betrayal of the Men Who Keep Us Free.
Yeah.
I think it gives us some real insight into the thinking behind these moves.
Yeah.
And he's very openly skeptical of what he calls woke culture in the military.
Right.
Particularly these diversity and inclusion initiatives.
Right. And he even goes so far as to question whether General Brown's race played a role in his appointment.
Yeah, which is a pretty inflammatory statement.
Oh, to
say the least.
It's a very loaded statement.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And I think, when we look at what Hegseth is saying and we look at Trump's actions, I think it suggests a real deep suspicion of DEI programs. diversity, equity, and inclusion programs within the military.
Right.
And that suspicion seems to be translating into actual policy.
Absolutely.
We've seen that with those 5,400 probationary Pentagon employees who were let go.
Yeah.
And we've seen it with that federal court having to step in to temporarily block Trump's ban on DE initiatives.
Wow.
I mean, this isn't just about a few personnel changes at the top. This really indicates a much larger shift.
Oh, absolutely.
In philosophy and priorities.
This is about reshaping the culture of the military.
Right.
Its values, and potentially even its identity.
Right. So now the question is, what are the implications of all of this reshaping? Where does it leave the U.S. military on the world stage? Where does it leave us?
Where does it leave us exactly?
We'll dig into all of that in part 2, so it wouldn't go anywhere. Okay, so we've talked a lot about, woke and how that seems to be a real sticking point for the Trump administration when it comes to the military. But how does that actually look in practice? How does an idea like that translate into?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really abstract idea, right?
Yeah.
And it's used in a lot of different ways too. I mean, woke itself is a really loaded term.
Yeah.
Often used, pejoratively to kind of dismiss progressive ideas or social justice movements. But in the context of the military, it seems to be this kind of shorthand for anything that challenges those traditional hierarchies and norms and values.
So we're talking about things like diversity and inclusion initiatives or discussions of race and gender equality or sensitivity training, like that sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. I think those are the types of programs and conversations that are going to be coming under scrutiny or potentially even facing elimination under this new regime.
And that's where we start to see some very real potential consequences.
Exactly.
Like we mentioned earlier, the impact on recruitment and retention.
Yes.
I mean, if the message from the top is that these issues don't matter, or worse, that they're somehow detrimental to military effectiveness, it just stands to reason that people who actually care about these issues might be less inclined to join or to re-enlist.
And we've already seen how important representation is.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about, when Colin Powell became the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it had a huge impact on recruitment among African Americans.
Yeah, I mean, it's about seeing yourself reflected in the leadership, knowing that there's a path for you regardless of your background.
Yes, absolutely.
Your beliefs.
Right. It's about belonging, feeling like you belong. And that's so critical for morale and cohesion.
Yeah.
Especially, in a high-stress environment like the military.
Of course.
If people don't feel valued for who they are or their perspectives are dismissed, it erodes trust. It undermines unit effectiveness.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. You can't really expect people to perform at their best.
Right.
To put their lives on the line.
To sacrifice.
If they don't feel like they're a part of a team that respects and supports them.
And it's not just about feelings, right? It's about operational effectiveness.
Right.
The military relies on diversity of thought, experience, perspective to solve those complex problems, adapt to these rapidly changing situations.
It's like that old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Exactly.
You need a diverse toolkit to really tackle the challenges of modern warfare.
That's a great analogy.
And that's where this idea of unintended consequences comes in.
Yeah, and that's what worries me.
Right.
By purging the military of all of these quote-unquote woke elements, they might be limiting their strategic options.
Right.
Making it harder to adapt to future threats.
So this is bigger than just, social justice or political correctness.
This is about having the most effective fighting force.
Having the best fighting force.
Drawing on everyone's strengths.
Right.
And it's also about maintaining trust with our allies.
Right.
A lot of our partners in NATO and other places have adopted those progressive values.
Right.
And they've implemented them within their own militaries.
So it makes me wonder how other countries are looking at these changes. I mean, are they worried? Are they confused? Do they see this as America kind of like...
Yeah, it's a great question.
Turning inward and rejecting that global community?
I think there's probably a mix of reactions.
Yeah.
Some countries might be, quietly pleased.
Yeah.
To see the U.S. pull back from this multilateralism, focus more on its own interest.
Especially those who felt pressured by the U.S. to adopt certain social or political reforms.
Exactly. They might see this as validation of their own values.
Right.
An opportunity to kind of assert themselves on the world stage.
But then you have other countries, especially in Europe and Asia, who have come to rely on the U.S. as a champion of democracy and human rights and liberal values. And they're probably deeply concerned by this shift in American foreign policy.
They might see it as the U.S. becoming less reliable, less willing to stand up for its values, and more prone to unilateral action.
And that has implications for global stability.
Exactly.
I mean, it could lead to increased tensions, mistrust, and even conflict.
It's a complicated picture.
Yeah.
We're only starting to see how this will all play out.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. I mean, it feels like the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
Not just for the U.S. military, but for
the world.
For everyone.
For the world.
It really does feel like we're at a crossroads here. You know, not just for the U.S. military, but for like the entire global order.
It does, yeah. It's like watching someone shake up a chessboard.
Yeah.
You know, all the pieces are moving around.
Right.
We don't really know what the game is going to look like yet.
We've talked about the impact on recruitment, morale, global perception.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering about the more like practical side of things, you know, military strategy, operations. How might these changes actually affect things like force posture, weapons development, you know, how the U.S. approaches conflict?
Well, I mean, if you look at Trump's stated priorities, right? Cutting budgets, streamlining the bureaucracy, focusing on traditional military strength. It seems to suggest this move away from the large-scale, technologically driven interventions that we've seen in recent decades.
So we're talking less emphasis on things like drone strikes, cyber warfare, special operations, the stuff that's been like the hallmark of the post-9/11 era.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay.
There seems to be this desire to kind of go back to a more conventional approach to warfare, focusing on air and naval power, armored divisions, potentially even nuclear deterrence.
Which makes sense, given Hegseth's background. You know, he's a former Army National Guard officer.
Yep.
And he's been pretty vocal in his criticism of what he sees as an over-reliance on technology and like a neglect of those traditional military skills.
Exactly. He's argued that the U.S. has been too focused on fighting those wars of choice in those far-flung corners of the world, and that we really need to be thinking about preparing for a potential conflict with a major adversary.
Like China or Russia.
Like China or Russia, exactly.
That seems like a pretty huge shift in strategic thinking. So what does that even mean for how the U.S. military is structured and deployed around the world?
Well, it could mean a reduction in overseas bases.
Okay.
Redeployment of troops to key strategic locations.
Okay.
A greater emphasis on training and readiness for that large-scale combat.
And maybe a renewed focus on developing and modernizing, like, conventional weapons systems.
Exactly.
Like tanks and fighter jets and aircraft carriers.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And that's where things get really interesting, because it raises all sorts of questions about military research and development. You know, if the emphasis is on traditional warfare, does that mean we're going to see a decline in investments in AI and cyber capabilities, space-based technologies?
I mean, that would be a pretty huge departure from the direction things have been moving in.
It would.
And it makes me think about, you know, the implications for the U.S.'s technological edge.
Right, which has always been
like
the cornerstone of our military dominance.
It seems like a bit of a gamble.
It is a gamble. It remains to be seen if this is going to work in the long run, especially with China and Russia developing their own.
Exactly, their own advanced capabilities.
Yeah.
A lot to think about here. It feels like we're at this real turning point.
We are.
Where all these old assumptions about warfare and national security are being thrown out the window.
Yeah.
And the future it's uncertain.
Yeah, very much up in the air.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into President Trump's Pentagon shakeup, what are like the key takeaways that you really hope our listener walks away with today?
I think the biggest one is recognizing that these changes are a lot more than just personnel changes.
Right.
This represents a fundamental shift in philosophy and strategy, potentially even national identity, you know?
Yeah.
And the decisions that are made in the next few months, the next few years, are going to have huge consequences.
Yeah.
Not just for the military, but for the global balance of power.
It's a real reminder that we all have a stake in this conversation.
Absolutely.
And the future of our nation's security is something that we should be, you know, actively engaged in trying to shape.
It is a complex landscape.
Yeah.
It's challenging, for sure.
It is.
But ultimately, it's up to all of us to decide what kind of future we want.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, folks. And as always, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep thinking critically about the world around you.